Okay, everyone, this is the next section of the lecture. This is part 5, and this is about using triggers. Now, triggers are very handy ways of, well, triggering an event or something to happen. And it basically means we can designate an object as being a trigger. So suppose, for example, we want to test if the user is in a certain area of the game world. For example, has entered in a room or is in close proximity to some object. So it's not necessarily the same as a collision with something. It's if the user is in a certain area or close to something. So a handy way to do this is to use a trigger. This is a general idea that's applicable in all sorts of situations. So when we attach a collider to a game object, we can also designate this as being a trigger, and we do this by checking the isTrigger box here. Now this means it won't act as something that you can collide with anymore, but instead simply generates this trigger event if you do so, which we can then use a kind of a special function to respond to. So the function that responds to trigger events via scripts is called onTriggerEnter. So if we attach a script that contains this function to an object which is designated as acting like a trigger via its box collider, then if something else enters into that space defined by the collider and the object, it'll run this code or whatever is inserted instead of this comment here. Now, the handy thing about this is that we can also get it to trigger responses if specific entities such as the player enters the collider. And we do this by using the notion of tag. A tag is a means of identifying some game object within a script attached to a different one. So for example, if I have a script attached to some object and I want something to happen if the player collides with it or enters that space, then I attach a tag to the first person controller or the third person controller if we're using that. And this is done via the inspector. So if I select the first person controller, I have a tag here that I can set to something. So let's suppose I set that tag to player. Then the following script will then provide a more kind of nuanced version of what we had before. onTriggerEnter, collider other, if other.tag is equal to player, do something. In this case, we're playing an audio file, where player is the tag associated with the first person controller. So what this will do is trigger a sound if the player collides with an object. So I have a script called responding.cs for a kind of a complete example of this. So let's have a look at this. Here we are. So this is a script responding.cs. Now effectively, this is really two different scripts in one, with some of it commented out. So let's ignore the commented out section for the moment. The script is called responding. It's got a start function that doesn't do anything, and it's also got an update function. And what the update function does is get the current audio source component and set it to my clip, which is something that's defined up here, and which is something that will be exposed within the script interface. So in other words, we can just set some audio file to be equal to my clip. This is exactly the same thing we did back in the collision testing script that we had in part 1. So that's the update function. And then within onTriggerEnter over here, basically I am saying onTriggerEnter get component audio source.play. Sorry, we can ignore this. I put that in for debugging purposes. So onTriggerEnter get component audio source.play. So in other words, if anything enters the collider area of this object, which is designated as a trigger, it will execute this bit of code here. So let's see how we need to set up the Unity scene in order to do something with this. So I've got pretty much the same scene as before. The difference is that I have simply turned one of these cubes green, just so I can see which one is which. Now, when you click on this cube here, you will see that I have a box collider. Okay? But see this larger green box that's around the object? This is the actual extent of the box collider. So in other words, it's bigger than the object itself. Now I did that by hitting this Edit Collider button, which then allows me to kind of drag this around and define a bigger collider area for the object. Let's make this collider even bigger than it is at the moment. So this means that if I enter this space at all, it is going to invoke this trigger event. As you can see, it's much bigger than the actual object. I have isTrigger checked here as well, and then I loaded up the responding script by throwing it onto the object as usual, and then within there I have my beep sound loaded in here as well, and I've created an audio source component. So if I play this, let's see what happens. I'm going to move over towards the green object. Yes, when I get to a certain point, it should invoke the trigger. Okay, so please note that this is not the same as a collision, because you'll see that it's not actually moving the object at all. It's simply detecting that we're inside the box defined by the box collider. And in fact, with that in mind, what I think I can do is, see this mesh renderer component? I think I can turn that off, which means it won't even render the green object at all. So effectively what that should mean now is I have a kind of a invisible area, and if I move within this, there it is, if I move into that area, it's triggering the sound. So you could imagine, for example, having an indoor environment and creating one of these invisible areas using a trigger which corresponds to a particular room, and then when the player enters that room, then we'll have some kind of event triggered. Now, I mentioned the notion of tags before. I've just clicked on the first-person controller, and you'll see that first-person controller is currently untagged. So I'm going to change it to be tagged as player. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to edit my script a little bit. So at the moment, if anything enters the trigger area, it'll play that sound. That may not be what we want. So for example, if I have other physics components in my scene, that means that if any of them happen to fall into that area, it'll also trigger the event. So I'm going to uncomment this stuff up here. And this is the same function, except it has an argument in it here for a collider, which is given the name other. And then if the tag of other is equal to player, then play the sound. So, you know, for all intents and purposes, this will do the same thing, I hope. But it's specifically only testing for collisions with the player, or will only trigger that sound if the player enters the area. There it is. Now, if I had other objects that weren't the player and they entered that area, it wouldn't trigger the sound. In fact, I can test this by untagging player and putting it back to being untagged. And now if I move into that area, which is around the invisible green cube, it shouldn't play the sound. Yeah. Okay, so that's how you use triggers. And we can use triggers to do all sorts of things. To go back to the lecture for a moment, the handy thing about colliders, they don't have to be the same size as the objects they're attached to. So that's what I just demonstrated there. If we want to sound a warning sound if the player gets close to some object, we can do it. Colliders can also be different shapes. They don't necessarily have to be boxes. They can be spheres and other kind of shapes as well. In fact, I think they can be pretty much arbitrary meshes if we need that. And they can also be attached to empty objects in order to trigger events based on the player entering some region of space. And essentially an empty object is simply a game object with no mesh attached. And you have pretty much the same effect by just turning off the mesh renderer on the object. So we can trigger things based on locations here as well. Okay, so that's it for that particular part of the lecture.